Hi, I'm Tom Zanton, and today I'm going to talk to you about starch and why meat not having much or any starch actually is important for human evolution. It's important for us to figure something out about human evolution. So I'm not going to talk about how starch is important because your brain, your red blood cells, your muscles, and the developing fetus all seem like they need a good amount of glucose. I'm not going to talk about how bifidobacteria, the natural inhabitant of the human gut, seems to prefer starch over fiber, with the one exception being inulin, the type of fiber found alongside starch to be abundant in root vegetables. What I actually want to talk about is something else. I don't know that I've ever heard anyone else talk about this. It's at least this connection that I want to make. It's the case that humans have the most starch-digesting enzyme in our mouths, salivary amylase. So we have this salivary amylase more than most other animals, at least most other primates. Most carnivores have none, like lions have none. And you could say, oh, well, we developed that at the dawn of agriculture, like no big deal. But we didn't. It's actually something that the best estimates are that we developed this starch-digesting enzyme in our mouths around 800,000 years ago, which is actually a pretty important date. And I think it's pretty interesting because it coincides with a new species, what most people consider to be a new species within the human lineage. So before 800,000 years ago, you had Homo erectus, and then now there's Homo sapiens. In between there, you have a species called Homo heidelbergensis, and they first appear, estimates are around 800,000 years ago. And they had a much larger brain than Homo erectus. Still not quite as large as Homo sapiens, but much larger than Homo erectus, which I think is interesting when you consider the estimates for when we developed this starch-digesting enzyme in our mouths. Because, first of all, it's important to know that salivary amylase, this starch-digesting enzyme in our mouths, is more effective at breaking down cooked starches than raw starches. So you say, okay, well, it makes sense for it to have happened, to have happened after we developed control of fire, and we happen to develop control of fire. Most people put that estimate at about 1 million years ago. About 1 million years ago, we start controlling fire, being able to create it and use it whenever we want. And then, then you have, then say you have this salivary amylase show up, this genetic mutation for increased salivary amylase show up, and then we have an increase in brain size. That makes sense if you assume that they were eating a lot of starch. If you assume they were eating a lot of starch, and then they controlled fire, and then they developed an adaptation that allowed them to break down cooked starches into more usable calories, then of course you would expect that their brains could grow bigger. And I think that's exactly what happened. However, that only makes sense if you assume that they were eating starch, or lots of starch. If you assume that they were eating mostly meat, then there's no reason for us to have developed and to have gotten an increased amount of salivary amylase 800,000 years ago, as opposed to, say, 10,000 years ago when we started farming. There's no reason really for it to have persisted this long. There's no explanation. If you say we ate a lot of meat, there's no explanation for why it would happen to coincide, this extra starch digesting enzyme in our mouths. Why would that coincide with an increase in brain size? There's no explanation if you say, well, we ate mostly meat. So to me, I think it seems pretty obvious, like it's a pretty neat fit. We were eating a lot of starch. We developed the control of fire. We developed a genetic mutation to allow us to break down cooked starches better. And then because of that, we had more available calories and our brain size increased. to me, like, that all makes perfect sense. If you say that it's because we ate meat, but like, like who knows about the starch digesting enzyme? Who knows why Homo heidelbergensis had bigger brains? Like there's no logical explanation. Like none of it makes sense together. And also, if you assume we ate a lot of starch, then that does explain why our brain, red blood cells, muscles, and the developing fetus all seem to rely on a consistent supply of glucose. And it would explain why the natural inhabitant of the human gut, bifidobacteria, seems to eat starch better than most types of fiber, the one exception being inulin, the type of fiber found with starch in root vegetables. So I hope you found this interesting, and if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And I want you to just always remember to eat your root vegetables. Thank you.